An expansive Egyptian burial site is discovered.
You would expect to find an elaborate tomb at the bottom of a shaft like this. But there is nothing decorative about this space.
This is a tomb, but something is still not quite lining up.
Mysterious buried treasure is unearthed in the Namib Desert.
Thousands of coins from various power centers of the time are pulled from the sand.
In total, over 2,000 gold, silver, and copper coins are found. This is an invaluable find.
And a World War II relic is found perfectly preserved in the sand.
It seems that it endured a pretty rough but successful landing. But if the plane crash landed, did the pilot survive?
Astonishing discoveries unearthed from the depths of the desert. Ancient lost cities. Forgotten treasures. Mysterious structures. Extraordinary curiosities, once lost to the sands of time, are finally revealed. As new technology uncovers remarkable tales hidden beneath the deserts of the world, the secrets in the sand will finally be exposed. Cairo, from the Arabic word meaning triumphant, is the capital city of Egypt. It sits along the Nile River, where the desert and the delta meet.
It's not only the cultural center of the Arab world, but it's Africa's most populous city with a population of more than 22 million people.
While a much more modern city as compared to the depth of Egyptian history, Cairo is surrounded by ancient sites, relics, and countless connections to the past.
32 kilometers south of Cairo, west of the modern Arab village of Saqqara, in the shadow of the Unas Pyramid, last excavated over 100 years ago. Archaeologists made a remarkable new discovery, directly next to the original site.
Beneath the sand, at the forgotten, crumbling site, teams unearthed the mouth of a shaft with 2 round holes cut into the ground next to it.
42 tons of debris are removed from the site, including thousands of shards of pottery and rock. But what it reveals has everyone stumped.
13 meters below the ground, they found a 5-meter by 8-meter ventilated room with even more ceramic jars and bowls, a table hewn from huge slabs of rock, and a large vessel still filled with ash, charcoal, and dark sand.
Based on the style of the pottery shards present in the layers throughout the shaft, experts date the site to around 600 BCE, making it around 2,500 years old. But what is this place?
Here in Egypt, you would expect to find an elaborate tomb at the bottom of a shaft like this. But there is nothing decorative about this space, nor is there a sarcophagus.
Egyptian burials ranged from modest shallow graves to elaborate majestic sites, like that of King Khufu's tomb at the Great Pyramid of Giza. The size and style depended on your status or class.
The only similarities of note here are the shaft itself and the air ventilation system. Tombs almost always feature some type of air shaft, believed to maintain airflow and keep the inevitable dust down.
Others believe these air vents may have had a more spiritual purpose, to allow the deceased soul to pass from the chamber and into the afterlife. But with no entombed body present, that reason doesn't really seem to apply.
Investigating further south along the site, they discovered the mouth of yet another shaft. Only this one was much larger and ran 30 meters below the surface.
The shaft is more similar to that of the pharaoh Djoser's tomb, a grand stepped pyramid. It's actually the first ever pyramid built in Egypt. It stands 62 meters above the sand and features a central 28-meter deep burial shaft.
The shaft leads to Djoser's tomb that features ornately carved stone and beautiful blue glazed tile. And it's only a short walk away from this new discovery. So perhaps this shaft leads to another pharaoh.
The shaft at Djoser's tomb is similar to this one, only it leads to something much more grand than the basic structure discovered here. This is a tomb, But something is still not quite lining up.
The newly discovered 30-meter shaft doesn't lead to just one tomb fit for a pharaoh, but contains many levels of niches, rooms, and tombs.
At 3 meters deep, there's a mummy in a small niche. And at 9 meters, there are 2 rooms of mummies, one of which has a few niches for individuals, but also rows of mummies stacked on top of one another.
Amongst the stacks of mummies is the burial of a wealthier woman. She is wrapped in a gilded plaster bodice inside an unfinished sarcophagus.
She was buried next to many Shabti figures, signifying her wealth and status, and yet also lies beside a very simple burial of a skeleton covered with only 4 stones. It's very strange.
Then, at 17 meters, there are many more mummies stacked on top of one another in the middle of the shaft, including some beautifully painted coffins. These haphazardly placed mummies are right next to the private compartment of 2 men from a single family. The variety here is fascinating.
Continuing the dig, at the bottom of the shaft, they discovered a second, smaller shaft, leading horizontally to a series of 6 tombs, cut into the bedrock.
There's a room to the west of the shaft that houses 2 mummies, one of which is in a very decayed wooden coffin.
This tomb is much more ornate than the discoveries found above it, and yet still more simple when compared to a royal burial. Deciphered inscriptions indicate that there is a priest entombed here.
The priest was wearing a gilded mask with black gemstone inlays for the eyes. Examination of the artifact proved that it was made almost entirely of pure silver, a very rare metal for the time.
Because the tombs of most ancient Egyptian dignitaries were looted, this mask is only the 3rd of its kind ever discovered in Egypt. And it is much more impressive and would have been much more expensive than the gilded plaster mask found in the tomb above.
Ancient Egyptians believed that the bones of their gods were made of silver and their flesh made of gold. Wearing a mask like this, made of precious metals, would have been seen as getting a step closer to the gods.
Famously, Tutankhamun was buried with a glorious double-layered high-carat gold mask. It was inlaid with colored glass, gemstones, quartz, and obsidian.
To the east is one of the larger tombs, and so far the deepest to be excavated. In Egyptian burials, the deeper the tomb, the closer the interred person was to the realm of the afterlife. It holds a single massive sarcophagus with a 5-ton lid, 2 sets of shabtis, and 2 boxes of alabaster canopic jars, used to hold the removed organs of the mummified body.
The jars bear the inscription of the entombed woman named Tadihor. This type and depth of burial, with so many funerary items, would have been very costly.
The last of the chambers contains 4 rotting wood coffins, and among them is a woman named Didibestet, who was buried with 6 canopic jars.
This is strange, because we've only ever seen or read about canopic jars being used in forts. This is because the ancient Egyptians believed that the lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines were each protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus.
The discovery of 6 jars for one person could signify a new style of burial tradition previously undocumented.
CT scans of the additional jars show that they do contain mummified tissues. However, the reason for 2 additional jars is still unknown, and likely doesn't represent a shift in tradition, but rather is just a unique case.
There are so many unique and surprising discoveries at this one site. Frankly, the discovery of a single mummy is still exhilarating and worthy of attention, but 54 mummies, that's really rare. Why were so many different people buried together?
After archaeologists uncovered a previously undiscovered Egyptian shaft containing 54 puzzling mummified remains, they were left wondering why so many were buried together. Back on the surface, ceramics experts were reconstructing the thousands of pot shards into hundreds of vessels, measuring cups, and bowls.
What's so interesting is the discovery that there are clear symbols painted onto each container with black ink. Only they don't appear to be decorative or canopic vessels, items traditionally associated with burials. So if not that, what were they for?
Each dish appeared to be labelled with the names of substances, notes about their use and rudimentary instructions. They included beeswax, conifer, pistachia, cedar oil, bitumen, and animal fat. And some were found to be mixed together in various concoctions.
These aren't casual items. They're chemicals and substances that were specifically used in the preparation, embalming, and mummification of bodies. So these mummies weren't just buried here, but likely prepared here as well.
The first discovery of the unidentified 5 by 9 meter room, with stone slabs, ventilation, a large pot filled with ash, which was likely an incense burner, all make more sense in this context as well.
If true, perhaps the odd room at the bottom of that 13-meter shaft is some kind of ancient morgue or a mummification workshop.
Exploring the grounds around the mouth of the shafts, experts were able to identify the foundation and remaining structure of a building and a ramp, with 2 large mud brick basins on either side.
This setup looks very similar to the historical records of Ibu tents, or tents of purification. This is where the first steps of the mummification process began. Here, the body would be washed with sweet-smelling herbs and then dried out before having the organs removed.
It's believed that this morgue-type room is a mummification workshop, where funerary practitioners performed both secret and religious rites to transition someone through the last phase of life.
It's all beginning to add up. The above and below ground mortuary workshops and embalming spaces and this shaft of many different burials seem to make up a massive funeral complex.
We often think of Egyptian burials as grand experiences with pyramids and ornate tombs for the pharaohs who ruled the land. But this site, the first of its kind to be discovered, tells us so much more about ancient Egyptian society, their needs, and their access to end-of-life services.
The fact that there were so many different styles of burial is evidence that there was a funeral package for anybody at any price point, from simple gilded plaster masks to expensive silver ones, making access to the afterlife available for all.
The Namib Desert spans an enormous area that traverses the borders of 3 different nations: Angola, Namibia, and South Africa. Almost entirely rainless, the sand reflects the parched environment with pale variations of orange and yellow.
The population of the Namib Desert is quite low. Barring a few isolated communities, it's virtually uninhabited.
This area of the Namib is known as the Sperrgebiet, or Forbidden Zone. It's very close to the border with South Africa, and it's so laden with natural resources that for a period of about 100 years, anyone without permission was barred from entering this area.
Around 20 kilometers from the nearest town of Oranienburg, a group of miners were building 20-meter-tall levees to section off the sea from the beach in order to expose the ocean floor and prepare the area for diamond mining, when they came across something that brought their work to a halt.
An excavator operator unearthed several heavy metal objects, each with a cylindrical shape. They narrow towards one end, while expanding into a rectangle on the other. And they appear to be made of bronze. What could these things be?
The mining company's chief geologist is called in to examine the objects. He concludes that their oblong shape is reminiscent of old cannons that were in use hundreds of years ago.
As with any technology, cannons have gone through their fair share of change. If you look at 16th and 17th century examples, you'll find that they're mostly long and rounded, narrowing toward the muzzle end. But these cannons have one side that's distinctively rectangular, allowing the archaeologists to identify them.
After examining the cylinders more closely, they identified them as breech-loading cannons. As opposed to muzzle loaders, where ammunition was loaded via the front of the weapon, these guns were loaded from the rear.
The shape of the guns indicate that they are hundreds of years old, predating anything that would have been in use even in the 19th century.
Cannons such as these would have been used both on land and at sea. But out here, the shoreline is vacant of any fort or fortifications.
This is also where the extremely powerful Benguela Current comes up from the South Atlantic. When you combine this with the reefs that line the shore and the frequent disorienting fog, you have a very good recipe for shipwrecks.
This has made the Skeleton Coast into the world's preeminent ship graveyard. The entire coastline is covered in shipwrecks, like the Edward Boleyn, a cargo ship that ran aground in 1909, the Otavi, which sank in 1945, and the Winston, wrecked in 1961, all of which testifies to hundreds of years of maritime activity.
Suspecting the cannons could be from an old shipwreck, the archaeologists also discovered what appeared to be 4 separate pieces of heavily corroded hardwood. And as excavations continued, they found long, smooth, bone-like materials clustered together in the wet sand.
It turns out these are elephant tusks, and the sheer number of them is astounding. They find more than 100 pieces of ivory, which is the largest collection of tusks ever found in a shipwreck.
The tusks have been impeccably preserved by the cold water coming up from the South Atlantic and by the seabed itself.
Starting in the mid-1400s, elephant ivory was sourced from the African continent, remaining a lucrative trade over the course of centuries.
The beginnings of trade in elephant ivory coincided with the Portuguese Empire's expansion and colonization of Africa's Atlantic coast. In 1494, the Pope had divided the New World into Spanish and Portuguese spheres of influence. The Spanish were granted control of everything west of the line of demarcation, and the Portuguese everything to the east, effectively granting them exclusive access to Western Africa.
If you also consider that the Portuguese had already been exploring the west coast of Africa and opening new trade routes to India, it makes you wonder if this wreck could be a Portuguese one.
Elephant ivory was a crucial commodity traded by the Portuguese Empire. So that means this ship could be from any time within a several hundred-year period.
As the team continued to dig, they uncovered a trove of half-moon-shaped metal objects. Hundreds of them were littering the muddy ocean floor.
These are called ingots. An ingot is a block of any metal, which in this case is copper.
Metals such as copper were melted into ingots because it allowed their shape and weight to be standardized, making it easier to store and ship the commodity. When they reached their destination, they were then melted down and made into whatever object or tool they were needed for.
As archaeological excavations continued in the drained seabed, small round objects that appeared to be precious metal emerged from the sand.
Thousands of coins from various power centers of the time are pulled from the sand. They find Venetian, French, and Moorish, as well as Spanish and Portuguese coins.
In total, over 2,000 gold, silver, and copper coins are found on the sea bottom. This is an invaluable find, not only because of the precious metals, but because coins provide an archaeologist with hard, irrefutable dates. Because we often know exactly when a coin was minted and when it was discontinued.
Over 90% of the coins were Spanish excelentes, stamped with the portraits of Queen Isabella of Castile and Leon and her husband Ferdinand II of Aragon. The coins were minted from 1497 to 1548. An extremely rare gold sovereign was also unearthed. This coin has an impression of an inner circle of pearls surrounding the cross of Christ. On the reverse side is the coat of arms of Portugal.
This is a coin minted over the course of several decades. However, this particular version stands out to numismatists.
Numismatists are people who study coins, and they know that this coin wasn't minted until 1525.
This particular coin was only in circulation until 1538. So that gives us a 13-year time frame when the ship would have been at sea.
Archaeologists combed through the Portuguese archives in search of any documentation relating to a ship that was lost off the coast of southern Africa between 1525 and 1538.
A letter from February 13, 1533, states that the Portuguese king sent knights to Seville to fetch 20,000 gold coins from investors for an India-bound fleet.
At this time, the voyage to India was typically undertaken by vessels called naus, essentially the workhorses of the Portuguese fleet. Naus were the vessel of choice for months-long voyages, where the ship would encounter some of the roughest seas imaginable.
Also known as carracks, the naus were essential to Portugal's ability to project its power across the seas. They were three-masted ships, measuring up to 45 meters long, and despite their size, could carry an immense amount of cargo.
The archaeologists discovered a manuscript that details ships that were lost in the year 1533, including a carrack known as the Bom Jesus, which was lost off the coast of southern Africa.
The Bom Jesus was captained by Dom Francisco de Noronha and had 300 people on board. Experts think that it encountered a fierce storm and either would have hit a shoal or drifted into the shore, where it then capsized, taking crew and cargo with it.
The Bom Jesus was headed for India, where the Portuguese hoped to trade some of its cargo for diamonds. Ironically, it ended up wrecked on a beach absolutely littered with diamonds. Talk about needing to be careful what you wish for.
The ship and its cargo are testament to the early period of globalization, where the transport and consumption of goods defined and continues to define power. Egypt's Al-Wadi Al-Jadid is an expanse of sand that covers nearly half the country. It takes up a significant portion of the Sahara Desert, and over the years, its inhospitable landscape has made life difficult for many people traveling across it.
It's located several hundred kilometers from Egypt's capital of Cairo. So once you're in it, it can take a long time to get out of it.
There are only 5 oases scattered across the western desert. Water is incredibly scarce, so whoever gets lost here is in serious trouble.
In 2012, a group of oil and gas surveyors were traveling through an area of the western desert when they came across something entirely unexpected.
They stumble upon an aircraft that appears to have been lying there for quite some time. It's nestled among large rocks, which must have made the landing incredibly uncomfortable. And owing to the absolute absence of humidity, the desert winds, and its remote location, the plane is in astoundingly good condition, as though it had been abandoned yesterday.
The propeller had been torn off and lay behind the aircraft. And on the other side of the plane, they discovered pieces of tire and scraps of metal.
Relatively speaking, the plane is in very good shape. It seems that it endured a pretty rough but successful landing. But if the plane crash landed, did the pilot survive?
After a well-preserved plane wreck was discovered in the middle of the Sahara Desert, a group of Italian archaeologists rushed to investigate. Upon arrival, they were immediately drawn to the cockpit.
There are no decayed remains inside the plane, and there are no human remains found in the immediate vicinity, meaning the pilot probably survived the crash landing.
There's only room for one man in the cockpit. So if there were to be remains at this site, they would be the remains of one person only.
The plane was like a time capsule. Inside the cockpit, the switches and controls were still in the same position they would have been in when the plane crash landed.
Mounted on each of the wings, there are 3 machine guns. And opening the ammunition compartments inside the wings reveals that it's loaded with live rounds for the 6 50 caliber machine guns.
The gun loading instruction panel is written in English. So, considering the apparent age of the plane, as well as the fact that these guns were primed for combat, it's safe to say that this plane flew for the Allies during the Second World War.
In 1940, the Axis powers invaded North Africa in an attempt to staunch oil supplies that were being shipped to Britain from the Persian Gulf via the Suez Canal. By 1942, the Italians and Germans were locked in a desperate battle against the British at El Alamein. If the Germans were allowed to further advance, the essential Allied oil supplies and control of the Suez Canal would be in serious jeopardy.
The Battle of El Alamein was the turning point of the war in North Africa. It was fought over 2 phases, stretching from July into November of 1942. Could it be that this fighter was shot down at some point during the Battle of El Alamein?
The battle extended across a front line that stretched from the coast to the Qattara Depression, which is very far from where this plane crash-landed.
The plane's engine was identified as a V-17-10-39 Allison. There were several Second World War-era planes that used this engine, but 3 of the most common were the American-designed P-38 Lightning, the P-51 Mustang, and the P-40 Kitty Hawk.
This plane is definitely not the P-38 because its fuselage is completely different. And it isn't the P-51 either, as its wings were typically armed with 4 .30 caliber machine guns, not 6.
That leaves the P-40 Kitty Hawk, a fighter that saw use in the earlier stages of the Second World War. And although they were produced by the Americans, they were used by Commonwealth forces as well.
When the US entered the war, the P-40 was its best and most common fighter. So these planes were rushed to a variety of different Allied air forces fighting in different theaters. In the end, some 28 different air forces ended up using this plane. So which one of these air forces did this plane belong to?
While inspecting the fuselage, the Italians found evidence of anti-aircraft fire. A large caliber round had torn through the rear and damaged the plane severely, in particular, the landing gear.
Although the landing gear is damaged, it's also out, so perhaps the plane was shot up while the wheels were down.
Could it be that this fighter was heavily damaged in combat and had to perform an emergency landing all the way out in the middle of nowhere, hundreds of kilometers from the fighting?
While searching for further clues as to who had piloted this plane and why it had landed in the middle of the Wadi al-Jadid, the archaeologists found a piece of tattered white silk by the aircraft's nose.
White silk is interesting because we know that the English made parachute canopies out of silk until 1943, with nylon replacing it in the following years. This would coincide with our timeline of the Battle of El Alamein.
So this is what remains of the pilot's parachute. He must have used it to protect himself from the sun. Out here, the heat can be absolutely excruciating, with temperatures easily reaching into the high 30s.
Upon further examination, the Italians found the telltale symbol of the Royal Air Force under the wings, so it must have been flown by a British pilot.
But why would the fighter be out here? The Battle of El Alamein and the rest of the North African campaign were fought closer to the coast, not hundreds of kilometers to the south.
This is an impossibly unforgiving environment. And without water, a person can only survive for 3 days, if not less. The poor pilot would have known that he was in a race against time. It's impossible to even imagine what would have been going through his mind after crash landing out here.
Despite no human remains, the archaeologists were sure they were in an area where someone would have suffered incredible physical and mental hardship. So they inspected all the surrounding debris, hoping for clues as to what had happened to the pilot. Beside the crash site, they discovered the aircraft's battery and radio.
It appears that the pilot had removed the radio and rigged it to the battery to try to call for help. The lack of remains could suggest that he was successful in doing so.
Next, the archaeologists found an identification plate with the plane's serial number 1035. They ran it through the archives, hoping it would provide more information as to who piloted the P-40.
The records indicate that the plane was flown by 24-year-old Flight Sergeant Dennis Copping from Essex in England. He was a pilot in 260 Squadron and was part of the force that was tasked with preventing the Germans from reaching the Suez Canal.
hoping to find any indication or hints as to what had become of Copping. Their search was expanded beyond the immediate area surrounding the plane.
It's hard to believe, but out there in the middle of the desert, after 2 hours of walking and 5 kilometers from the wreck, they find a metal button. It's imprinted with the year 1939 and the text, "Made by SSD Brothers," a company we think produced goods for the armed forces.
It's incredible. This is actually like finding a needle in a haystack. But that being said, there is no way of proving that this would have been a button from Copping's uniform. Although, why would an English button from 1939 be out here?
Back in the archives, they found oral testimony from the pilot who had flown alongside Copping. Flight Sergeant L. Shepard stated that on the early morning of the 28th of June 1942, while on a reconnaissance flight, Copping was hit by anti-aircraft fire.
This was evidenced by the huge tears through the airplane's fuselage. But what Shepard also says is that although this damage wasn't enough to bring the fighter down, it did damage the landing gear.
Flying with damaged landing gear could be incredibly dangerous. If for some reason it can't be put down following takeoff, the landing would have to be done without wheels, which is probably easier said than done.
Following the early morning reconnaissance flight, Copping and his colleague were ordered to fly 200 kilometers to the east to have their landing gear fixed at the repair station LG-100.
But something was wrong. Not long after takeoff, Shepard noticed that Copping was headed southwest, way off course.
Shepard broke radio silence in order to warn him. He even flew up close and tried to use hand signals to indicate he was heading the wrong way. But strangely, Copping didn't respond and just kept going.
Realizing that if he continued along the same course as Copping, he too would end up in trouble, Shepard changed course. Tragically, Copping didn't follow and instead kept heading towards Wadi al-Jadid.
He had enough fuel for about 3 hours and eventually would have been forced to land. In the end, crash landing hundreds of kilometers from his intended destination.
You wonder, why didn't he respond to Shepard's attempt at communicating? Maybe the radio was damaged by flak, or maybe Copping himself was convinced that he was heading in the right direction. But that still doesn't explain why he never responded to Shepard whatsoever.
Approximately 10 kilometers from the plane, the archaeologists explored a ravine littered with boulders. In a rock crevice, they found more remnants of the pilot's white silk parachute. Spurred on, they looked for further clues and were astonished when they unearthed what appeared to be human remains.
There's a total of 12 bones clustered in the sand. Ribs, vertebrae, a clavicle, as well as finger and foot bones. Could it have been here that the unfortunate pilot met his end?
After the wreck of a British World War II plane was found deep in the sands of the Sahara Desert, archaeologists expanded their search and were astounded to discover human remains 10 kilometers from the wreck.
When you come across something like this, you have to remember that despite being an incredible discovery, what you're observing is a human tragedy. A young man, likely suffering, desperate and afraid, died under terrible circumstances.
He probably came this way in an attempt to walk out of the desert, but he likely didn't have much water. And in this sun and heat, that doesn't give you much time.
After performing DNA analysis on the bones, the Egyptian government stated that the tests were inconclusive, claiming they were too old to assess properly.
This is a bit strange, because bones of fallen servicemen from the Second World War are frequently and accurately identified. And the Egyptians also say that the bones are all from the same person, even though they don't know who that person is.
Even though the bones can't be identified, it doesn't discount the possibility that they are really Flight Sergeant Copping's remains.
The official British position is that the bones aren't Copping's remains, and with this, appear to have put the matter to bed. So we may never know if this ravine in the Wadi al-Jadid really is his final resting place. But we can spare a thought for him and his family and hope that they may one day receive a definitive answer.
Flight Sergeant Copping made the ultimate sacrifice in an extraordinary effort that halted the German advance in North Africa, spelling the beginning of the end for the Axis powers.
The Nazi armies were forced to retreat for 1,000 miles. They were hurled off the continent of Africa, never to return.
On a small peninsula, northwest of Keelung City, Taiwan, lies Baduzi Seaside Park, jutting out into the East China Sea.
Located approximately 25 kilometers from Taipei, Keelung is a prominent port city surrounded by mountains. It has long been associated with military bases and has a successful fishing industry.
This is a unique environment of rocky, eroded sandstone, sandwiched between grasslands and the sea.
A geologist at Kochi University was searching for fossil impressions of stingrays along the jagged sandstone shore when he discovered something unexpected. Strange shapes frozen in the stone.
To the untrained eye, they look plain, like darkish lines etched into the rock face. But to an expert, they're so much more.
These traces are left by an ancient organism living in the sediment long ago. These traces then become preserved over time, transforming into what we call trace fossils. There are many different kinds of trace fossils, including footprints, burrows, and nests.
These are burrows, the holes or tunnels dug by animals, usually used as a home. But they don't match anything in the fossil record.
The imprinted burrows appear to have been tunneled into the ground long ago. And the mouth of the burrow is 2 to 3 centimeters wide, and it runs over 30 centimeters deep into the rock formation. But what kind of animal made it?
Given the width of the passage found here, it's possible it could have been a small rodent's burrow.
Mice tend to have small burrows approximately 3 centimeters in diameter and are found in a variety of shapes, complex layouts, and designs.
In fact, a similar fossilized imprint of a rodent burrow was found in America, which shares some overall features with the burrows discovered in Taiwan. Though these burrows are a bit larger, with a diameter of 8 to 9 centimeters.
Looking for further evidence, scientists expanded their search, and 23 kilometers away, they made a similar discovery along the rocky shores of Yellow-U Geopark.
Here they find a more complete fossil. Beginning at the mouth, the burrow appears to go down 70 centimeters before gradually bending horizontally to form a shape like an elongated capital L.
The rock formations at Yellow-U and at the original discovery at Baduzi are both from the Miocene era, a period between 22 and 5 million years ago.
But Taiwan was only formed 4 to 5 million years ago. In geological terms, it's a relatively young and developing island.
The island of Taiwan is 400 kilometers long and at its broadest, 150 kilometers wide. It was formed following the collision of 2 tectonic plates, the Eurasian to the west and the Philippine Sea Plate to the east.
Given its placement along so many fault lines, there is near constant crustal movement, shifting, lifting, and altering the island's terrain. The Eurasian plate is actually lifting the island up at a rate of 5 millimeters per year.
This area is comprised mostly of marine rocks, indicating that this land was once actually the seafloor.
So these rocks were underwater and were actually just sand before the burrow was fossilized. So no furry rodents could have made it. Instead, we're looking for a marine animal. But which one?
X-ray fluorescence core scanning determines the chemical composition of marine sediments over time. Using XRF, experts noted there was an elevated level of iron in the burrow lining.
The variation in iron suggests that this was a mucus-secreting marine animal. This could include eels, shrimps, and mollusks.
Some species of eel, like the garden eel, dig their burrows in groups along the seafloor and use mucus to line their tunnel structure.
However, garden eels have a much more erratic, squiggly burrow structure compared to the smooth, tube-like structure of the unidentified burrows found here in Taiwan.
This smooth lining technique is noted with marine invertebrates like shrimp, who are known for constructing long burrows and might need more support due to their lack of bone structure. So perhaps these are shrimp burrows.
But these burrows tend to have a more complex structure and take on a U-shaped dual entrance design with maze-like inner workings that would normally be lined with mud pellets. So this can't be a fossil shrimp burrow.
Another major category of mucus-secreting invertebrates are large polychaetes, commonly known as bristleworms.
Most large polychaetes are sea-dwelling and do live in burrows in the sand or mud. And given the smooth shape of the unidentified burrow structure and the overall thin diameter, a long, slender worm could have made it.
Examining the imprints further, scientists noticed a unique collapse structure, something that occurs when the internal load-bearing structure fails and falls into itself. This causes the walls to be pulled inside the bounds of its original shape.
Around the mouth and vertical position of the structure, scientists notice an interesting feather-like collapse structure.
The feather-like structure around the upper burrow indicates that the opening went through repeated cycles of collapse and rebuild. And this is consistent with the behaviors of an ambush predator.
Ambush predators, or sit-and-wait predators, are carnivorous animals that lure, trap, and surprise attack their prey. Whatever lived in this fossilized burrow created a unique signature in the stone through the act of dragging their prey through the mouth of the burrow to feast.
What kind of nightmarish worm, like something out of Beetlejuice, Tremors, or Dune, could be responsible for these burrows? The bobbit worm.
Unlike the earthworms that we're most familiar with, bobbit worms are venomous and have a massive snake-like body. They can grow to between 2 to 3 meters long, with a bodily diameter of up to 2.5 centimeters. A perfect fit for these fossilized burrows.
Bobbit worms lay in wait along the sea floor, with their 5 antennae and mouthparts that look like bony hooks peeking out from the sand. They wait for any hint of movement or the shadow of a fish swimming nearby, then strike.
While not quite the size of Hollywood sandworms, up close, these massive, blind, brainless killers are equally terrifying. They have the speed and strength to split a fish in half, but they aren't picky eaters, and they'll attack anything that crosses their path.
The unknown trace fossil discovered in Taiwan has now been added to the record and named Panicnus formosae.
Experts believe that 20 million years ago, the ancient bobbit worm colonized the seafloor along the Eurasian plate, long before the formation of the island we know as Taiwan. But these worms are far from extinct and are well documented in the tropical and subtropical waters of the Indo-Pacific.